the Chocolatier's last truffle. Good evening, and welcome to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and tonight I have the privilege of sharing with you a most peculiar case, one that unfolded in the glittering world of haute chocolaterie, where passion and precision dance together in the most delicate of balances. Our story begins in Brussels, that magnificent city of cobblestones and culture, where a terrible tragedy struck during what should have been a celebration of culinary artistry. Chapter 1. A Bitter Beginning. The Grand Concours International de Chocolat was the most prestigious event of its kind. Held annually in the ornate Salle Royale, it attracted chocolatiers from every corner of the globe, each hoping to claim the coveted Golden Cacao Award. This particular year, the competition had drawn exceptional attention, for among the finalists was none other than Édouard Fontaine, Belgium's own master chocolatier, whose creations were said to capture the very essence of poetry in chocolate form. The morning of the final round arrived with crisp autumn air and golden sunlight streaming through the hall's magnificent windows. 5 distinguished judges had been assembled, each a renowned expert in their field. There was Madame Colette Mercier, the stern French pastry chef whose Parisian establishment had earned 3 Michelin stars. Beside her sat Anton Kraus, the methodical German food critic, whose reviews could make or break a career. The third judge, Isabella Romano, was an Italian chocolatier whose family had crafted confections for 4 generations. The fourth, William Henderson, represented the emerging American chocolate scene with his innovative fusion techniques. Finally, there was the elderly Professor Henrik Larsson, a Swedish food scientist who had literally written the textbook on chocolate chemistry. The competition proceeded through the morning with remarkable creations presented one after another, yet everyone knew the true spectacle would be Édouard Fontaine's final presentation. At precisely 2 o'clock he emerged from the preparation area, carrying a single black velvet box. The audience fell silent as he approached the judges' table, his face bearing an expression of quiet triumph. Inside the box rested 5 identical truffles, each a perfect sphere of dark chocolate crowned with a delicate gold leaf. Édouard explained his creation in hushed, reverent tones, a ganache infused with rare Tanzanian cocoa, Madagascar vanilla, and a secret ingredient he would reveal only after the judges had tasted it. His voice carried the pride of a man who knew he had created something extraordinary, something that would cement his legacy forever. The judges each selected a truffle with ceremonial precision. They lifted them in unison as tradition dictated and placed them in their mouths. 4 faces registered pleasure and surprise, their expressions transforming as the complex flavors unfolded on their palates. The 5th, Édouard Fontaine himself, who by custom always tasted alongside the judges, suddenly clutched his throat, his face contorted in agony, the color draining from his cheeks in an instant. Within moments he collapsed to the floor, convulsing terribly before going still, his eyes wide with shock and incomprehension. The hall erupted in chaos. Someone screamed. Others rushed forward. But it was already too late. The master chocolatier was dead, his final creation having become his final moment. Chapter 2. The detective arrives. The Belgian authorities acted swiftly. The hall was sealed, the judges sequestered, and every attendee's details recorded. Medical personnel arrived within minutes, but there was nothing to be done. The body was examined where it lay, and the preliminary conclusion was immediate and disturbing: poison, and a particularly vicious one at that. Yet, as the initial shock subsided, a troubling realization emerged. The death bore the unmistakable signs of deliberate murder, but no one could explain how it had occurred. The truffles had been prepared in full view of officials, never left Édouard's sight, and he alone had touched them before presentation. It was Madame Mercier who suggested consulting an outside expert. She had once encountered a peculiar Belgian detective in Paris, a man whose methods were unorthodox, but whose results were undeniable. A telegram was dispatched, and by evening the detective had arrived at the Salle Royale, accompanied by his friend and chronicler. The little Belgian detective surveyed the scene with bright, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He was immaculately dressed, his suit pressed to perfection, his shoes gleaming like mirrors. His most distinctive feature was a pair of magnificent moustaches, waxed to points and maintained with obvious pride. He examined the competition hall with meticulous care, pausing to straighten a crooked chair here, aligning spoons there, all the while absorbing every detail with the precision of a master watchmaker. Captain Beaumont of the Brussels police greeted him with a mixture of relief and scepticism. "Monsieur, I understand you have some reputation in these matters, but I must tell you, this case is impossible. The victim died from his own creation, yet we have found no trace of poison in the remaining truffles, no means of introduction, and no conceivable opportunity for tampering." The detective smiled slightly, his magnificent moustaches twitching with amusement. "My dear Captain, the impossible is merely the improbable that has not yet been properly examined. Tell me, these judges, they are still here, yes?" "All 5 are in separate rooms, as you requested. They're quite agitated, demanding to know when they can leave. The Italian woman has been crying for hours, and the American keeps threatening to call his embassy." "Excellent. Agitation often loosens the tongue. But first, I wish to see the kitchen where Monsieur Fontaine prepared his final creation. Every detail, no matter how small, may prove significant. The solution to this puzzle lies not in grand gestures, but in tiny, overlooked particulars." The preparation area was a marvel of stainless steel and gleaming surfaces. Everything remained exactly as it had been at the moment of death. The marble slab where chocolate had been tempered, the copper pot used for ganache, the delicate moulds and tools of the chocolatier's art. Even the lingering scent of chocolate hung in the air, a bittersweet reminder of what had transpired. The detective moved through the space with balletic precision, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or examine a surface with a magnifying glass he produced from his waistcoat pocket. His companion took notes, watching with admiration as the detective's mind worked through possibilities with mathematical precision. "You see here, my friend," the detective murmured, pointing to a cooling rack with his gloved finger. 5 truffles were made, 5 truffles were presented. Simple, no? Yet I observe something curious. Notice the spacing of the marks on this dusting of cocoa powder. 6 impressions, not 5. Someone has been most careless. His companion leaned closer, squinting at the surface. Indeed, there was a 6th circular mark, slightly smudged as if something had been removed and the area hastily cleaned. A practice truffle, perhaps. Chocolatiers often make test pieces. Perhaps. Or perhaps something more significant. Come, let us interview these distinguished judges. I have a feeling that this competition concealed darker passions than mere culinary rivalry. In my experience, wherever there is great talent and great prizes, there also lurks jealousy, ambition, and occasionally murder. Chapter 3. 5 Judges, 5 Stories. The first interview was with Madame Colette Mercier, whose composed demeanour had returned since the initial shock. She sat ramrod straight in her chair, her silver hair pulled back severely, her hands folded precisely in her lap. Despite the ordeal, her makeup remained perfect, her clothing unwrinkled. She was a woman who maintained control even in crisis. "Madame," the detective began gently, settling into the chair opposite her, "you have known Monsieur Fontaine for many years, yes?" "I have known of him, monsieur. Our paths crossed at various competitions, but I would not say we were acquainted personally. He was a perfectionist, admirable in his craft, though perhaps not the warmest of personalities. He kept his distance from other professionals, guarded his techniques jealously." "And today's competition? Were you surprised by his entry?" A flicker of something crossed her face, annoyance perhaps or recognition. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I was surprised by his boldness. The combination he described suggested techniques that, well, they reminded me of someone else's work, someone who is no longer with us. Whose work, madame? She hesitated, her fingers tightening, almost imperceptibly. There was a chocolatier, now deceased, who worked in Lyon, Marguerite Dubois. She was my dear friend and confidant for nearly 20 years. Some years ago, she developed an extraordinary method for infusing ganache with multiple flavor profiles without separation or muddling of tastes. It was revolutionary, truly revolutionary. She shared it only with me and kept detailed notes in a journal, a leather-bound book she carried everywhere. When she died 2 years ago, that journal disappeared from her workshop before her estate could be inventoried. The detective's eyes brightened with interest. And you believe Monsieur Fontaine possessed this journal? I cannot prove it, but yes, the technique he described today was unmistakably Marguerite's. I would recognize her work anywhere, the way the flavors developed in stages, the texture of the ganache, even the subtle use of temperature variation. It was as if she had made that truffle herself from beyond the grave. Did you confront him about this? No. I had no proof, and accusations without evidence would only make me appear bitter and jealous. I intended to taste the truffle first, to be absolutely certain, and then decide how to proceed. But now... She trailed off, her composure finally cracking slightly. After thanking Madame Mercier, the detective proceeded to Anton Krause's quarters. The German critic was pacing like a caged animal, his precise features twisted with frustration. His typically neat appearance was dishevelled, his tie loosened, his hair disarranged from running his hands through it repeatedly. This is intolerable. I have a review deadline tomorrow, and instead I'm imprisoned here like a common criminal. I have done nothing wrong. Nothing. I merely came to judge chocolate, not to become entangled in some Belgian murder investigation. My apologies, Monsieur Krause. I shall be brief. Tell me, had you judged Monsieur Fontaine's work before? Twice. Both times I gave him mediocre marks, 72 out of 100 in Munich, 68 in Vienna. His technique was adequate but lacked innovation. He relied too heavily on traditional methods, never pushing boundaries. Today's presentation was different, shockingly so. Either the man had undergone a remarkable transformation or, prompted the detective, or he had acquired knowledge from elsewhere. That truffle was genius, monsieur, far beyond what Fontaine had shown himself capable of previously. I have judged hundreds of chocolatiers in my career. I know the ceiling of each artist's ability. Fontaine exceeded his by an impossible margin. Chapter 4. Hidden Grudges. Isabella Romano proved to be a woman of passionate temperament. She greeted the detective with tears streaming down her face, dabbing at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief that bore her family's crest. Her mascara had run in dark streaks, and her hands trembled as she gestured dramatically while speaking. It is too terrible to die in such a way in front of everyone. Whatever his faults, no one deserves such an end. To collapse like that, suffering so terribly, I shall have nightmares for months, I am certain of it. His faults, Signora. Please elaborate. Isabella's tears stopped abruptly, replaced by a flash of anger that transformed her face. 3 years ago, my younger brother Marco competed against Fontaine in Rome. Marco's creation was extraordinary. The judges all said so. A masterpiece of white chocolate and pistachio that should have won easily. Yet Fontaine won with a pedestrian dark chocolate torte. Later, we learned he had befriended one of the judges beforehand, had taken him to dinner multiple times, sent gifts to his family. The appearance of impropriety cost my brother his confidence. He gave up chocolate making entirely and now sells insurance in Naples. Insurance! Can you imagine the tragedy of such wasted talent? You believed the competition was fixed. I know it was, monsieur, but there was no proof that would stand in court, and Fontaine's reputation protected him. His lawyers threatened anyone who spoke openly about it. When I was invited to judge this competition, I accepted specifically to ensure he would not cheat again. I watched him like a hawk today. He had no opportunity to manipulate anything, no chance to bribe or influence. I made certain of it. And yet, he died. Yes, and I feel no sorrow for it, though I suppose I should. Perhaps his past sins caught up with him. Perhaps God decided justice must be served. I do not know, and frankly, monsieur, I do not care. My conscience is clear. The detective thanked her and moved on to William Henderson, the American, who sat casually, with his feet propped on a table, chewing gum with methodical precision. His relaxed posture contrasted sharply with the tension of the other judges. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt rather than formal attire, and his manner was distinctly informal. "Look, I'll level with you," Henderson said, before any questions were asked, waving away the detective's opening pleasantries. "I didn't know Fontaine well, didn't particularly like what I'd heard about him, but I judged chocolate, not character. That's not my job. My job is to assess flavour, technique, presentation. That truffle was the best thing I've ever tasted, and I've tasted a lot. If the guy stole the recipe, and I'm hearing rumours he did, then he stole from a genius. Doesn't mean he deserved to die for it, though. Theft isn't a capital crime last time I checked." "You heard he stole the recipe? From whom did you hear this?" Henderson shrugged, unwrapping a fresh stick of gum. "Someone mentioned it before the competition started. Can't remember who. Maybe it was the Italian lady, maybe the French woman. There's always gossip at these things. Half of it's jealousy, the other half is probably true. The chocolate world is small and catty, man. Everyone knows everyone's business." "Did you notice anything unusual during the preparation or presentation?" "Not really. Fontaine seemed nervous, but they all do. High stakes, you know. The winner gets serious money and prestige, career-making stuff. He handled those truffles like they were his children, super careful. Nobody got near them except him, which makes this whole poisoning thing kind of impossible, if you ask me." Chapter 5. The Professor's Tale. The final interview was with Professor Henrik Larsson, and it proved the most illuminating. The elderly Swede sat in an armchair surrounded by scientific journals, a cup of tea growing cold at his elbow. He had the distracted air of an academic, though his eyes were sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His hands, gnarled with age, rested on the arms of the chair with surprising steadiness. "Professor," the detective began, settling into the opposite chair with careful precision, "you are a man of science. What did your scientific observation tell you about today's tragedy?" The professor removed his spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully with a soft cloth from his pocket. "That it was entirely unnatural, monsieur. The symptoms suggested a fast-acting poison, likely something affecting the nervous system. Cyanide would be my first hypothesis, given the speed of onset and the victim's reactions. But here is what puzzles me from a scientific standpoint. The other 4 truffles were analysed immediately after the death by the medical team. No poison was found, not a trace, not even at the molecular level. The tests were quite thorough. Yet one truffle clearly contained poison. Indeed, which suggests either remarkable luck in distribution, statistically improbable, or—" He paused, replacing his spectacles with deliberate care. "Or the poison was not in the truffle itself." "Precisely. I have been considering alternatives since the incident occurred. The gold leaf, perhaps. Cyanide salts can be disguised in various forms. Or something in his preparation area that only he would have contacted. A contaminated utensil, perhaps, or residue on his hands that transferred to his mouth when he tasted." The detective nodded slowly, filing away these observations. "Professor, I understand you knew the late Marguerite Dubois." The professor's face softened immediately, years seeming to fall away. "Ah, Marguerite. Yes, I knew her well. We collaborated on several papers about chocolate chemistry, the crystallization of cocoa butter, the Maillard reaction in various cacao strains, temperature-dependent flavor development. She was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. One of the finest minds I ever encountered in my 50 years of research. Her death was a great loss to the field, a tragedy beyond measure. And her journal, the one containing her revolutionary techniques? The one that went missing? Yes, I knew of it. She had confided in me that she planned to publish its contents within the year. Revolutionary. Techniques that would have changed chocolate making forever. Democratized knowledge that had been locked away in guild secrets for generations. Then she died suddenly, a heart condition no one knew she had, and the journal vanished from her locked workshop. I always suspected someone stole it, someone who knew its value, but there was no evidence, no leads to follow. Did you suspect Fontaine? The professor's silence was answer enough. His jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the window where dusk was beginning to settle over Brussels. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. I had my suspicions. Yes, Fontaine visited Lyon around the time of her death. I checked travel records afterward. And then, months later, his work suddenly improved dramatically. Too dramatically. But suspicion is not proof, monsieur. In science, we deal with evidence, with reproducible results. I had neither. Chapter 6. A Secret Recipe. That evening, the detective requested access to Édouard Fontaine's personal effects, which had been collected from his hotel room and brought to the police station. Among his belongings, expensive luggage, fine clothing, various competition materials, they discovered a locked briefcase of Italian leather, surprisingly heavy for its size. The lock was examined by a police specialist who declared it virtually unpickable, a custom mechanism of high quality. However, the detective produced from his waistcoat pocket a small leather case containing various delicate instruments. Within moments, the lock clicked open, and the briefcase revealed its contents. "This is Marguerite Dubois' journal," the detective announced to Captain Beaumont, lifting out a leather-bound book with reverent care. "See here," her name inscribed inside the cover in gold leaf, the dates of entries spanning 15 years, all in her elegant hand. And here, marked with a red silk ribbon, is the exact recipe Fontaine presented today. Every detail matches what the judges described, the proportions, the techniques, even the secret ingredient he had promised to reveal. Captain Beaumont leaned over to examine the journal, his weathered face creasing with concern. So he did steal it. But how does this help us? A dead thief is still dead, and we're no closer to knowing who poisoned him, unless you think this journal itself contained some clue. The detective smiled enigmatically, that peculiar expression that indicated his little grey cells were working at full capacity. Au contraire, my friend, we are much closer than you realize. Consider, 5 people knew about this journal's existence and its theft. 5 people had reason to hate Fontaine for possessing it. 5 people tasted his truffle today. The symmetry is, how do you say, elegant. Mathematics and murder often share similar patterns. But none of them had the opportunity. The truffles were never out of Fontaine's possession until he handed them directly to the judges. And he died from his own truffle, not one of theirs. How could any of them have poisoned it? Ah, yes, that is the puzzle within the puzzle. But I begin to see the outline of the truth. The method was sophisticated, requiring specific knowledge of chemistry and chocolate making. Tell me, Captain, has the medical examiner completed his full report? Just arrived an hour ago. I have it here. Captain Beaumont retrieved a folder from his desk. Death by cyanide poisoning. Extremely fast-acting. The amount required would have been substantial. Approximately 500 milligrams, according to the toxicologist. That's impossible to hide in a truffle without affecting the taste dramatically. Cyanide has a bitter almond scent and flavor that should have been immediately noticeable. Unless the detective's eyes gleamed with that particular light that indicated a crucial realization. unless the poison was not meant to be tasted at all, but rather absorbed through a different mechanism. Captain, I require one more piece of information. Fetch me the records of Marguerite Dubois' death. I wish to see the complete medical report and the police investigation file, if one exists. Captain Beaumont departed, returning an hour later with a dusty file retrieved from archives. The detective read through it carefully, occasionally nodding to himself, making small notes in a leather notebook he carried. As I suspected, Marguerite Dubois did not die of natural causes. Not entirely. Her death certificate mentions heart failure, yes, but look here at the attending physician's notes buried in the middle of the report. Unexplained chemical burns in mouth and throat, consistent with ingestion of caustic substance, possibly related to her work with chocolate chemistry. The report was filed, then apparently forgotten in the aftermath of her death when her family insisted on a quick, quiet funeral. You're saying she was murdered too? I am saying, Captain, that we are dealing with someone who has killed before and nearly gotten away with it. This time, however, justice will not be cheated. Tomorrow morning, I shall demonstrate exactly how this impossible crime was committed. Chapter 7. The Reconstructed Crime. The following morning, the detective assembled all 5 judges in the competition hall. The space had been thoroughly cleaned, but the atmosphere remained heavy with the memory of tragedy. A table had been prepared with 5 fresh truffles, identical in appearance to those from the tragic day, created by a master chocolatier under strict police supervision. Mesdames, messieurs, the detective began, standing before them with his hands clasped behind his back. I have asked you here to demonstrate how the murder of Édouard Fontaine was accomplished. But first, I must tell you a story about revenge, about stolen knowledge, and about a crime that was 2 years in the making. Please, be seated, for this will take some time. He paced slowly before them, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Marguerite Dubois was murdered 2 years ago by someone who wanted her revolutionary techniques, or rather wanted to prevent them from being published. The killer made it appear natural, using a sophisticated understanding of chemistry to induce what appeared to be a heart attack. But they left traces, evidence the authorities overlooked in their haste to close the case. After stealing her journal, this person waited, knowing the techniques would eventually be used publicly. And when Fontaine, who had purchased the journal from the original thief, announced his participation in this competition, the murderer saw an opportunity for justice, or rather revenge. Madame Mercier stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Are you accusing one of us of killing Marguerite? This is outrageous. I demand you produce evidence immediately. Please, sit down, madame. All will become clear, I assure you. You see, the murderer faced a significant problem. How to kill Fontaine in a way that would expose his theft while ensuring no innocent person would be harmed. The solution was ingenious, and it relied on a deep understanding of chocolate chemistry and Fontaine's own predictable habits. He gestured to the truffles on the table with a sweeping motion. These appear identical, do they not? Perfect spheres, identical in size and appearance, yet I assure you one contains a deadly poison, placed there under my supervision this morning as part of this demonstration. Can any of you tell which one? The judges stared at the truffles nervously. None moved to touch them. Isabella Romano actually pushed her chair back slightly, as if the chocolates might leap from the table. Of course you cannot. They are identical because the poison is not inside the chocolate, you see. It is on the surface, specifically on the gold leaf that crowns each truffle. But not just any gold leaf. This gold leaf has been treated with cyanide salts that remain stable at room temperature, but crystallize and release their poison when exposed to the exact combination of mouth temperature and moisture. The crystals dissolve instantly on the tongue, releasing the poison directly into the bloodstream through the highly vascularized tissue of the mouth. Professor Larson gasped audibly, his face going pale. But that would mean That would require extraordinary precision. The temperature threshold, the moisture activation, one would need to be an expert in both chemistry and the physical properties of gold leaf. Yes, Professor, it means the poisoned truffle had to be identified with absolute certainty. The murderer needed to ensure only Fontaine would receive it, that none of the judges would be harmed. This required intimate knowledge of Fontaine's habits and rituals. Chapter 8. The Damning Evidence. The detective continued his explanation, moving to a portable blackboard that had been set up in the hall. He drew diagrams with white chalk, his movements precise and methodical. Consider the preparation process, which I have reconstructed through interviews with competition staff and examination of the preparation area. Fontaine made 6 truffles, not 5. This 6th truffle was his practice piece, used to test the temperature of his chocolate, the consistency of his ganache, the setting time of his gold leaf. This is standard procedure for perfectionists like Fontaine. What happened to that 6th truffle? He paused dramatically, letting the question hang in the air. The judges shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. It disappeared because someone took it, someone who had legitimate access to the preparation area during the pre-competition inspection. That person carefully removed the original gold leaf and replaced it with poisoned leaf, then returned it to the cooling rack in a position where Fontaine would certainly take it when preparing his presentation box. But how could anyone know which truffle he would eat? Asked Anton Kraus, leaning forward in his chair. He chose randomly from the box when it came time to taste. Did he? Consider what we know about Édouard Fontaine. Multiple witnesses from previous competitions have testified to his habits. He was a perfectionist, a man of rigid habits and superstitious rituals. When presenting to judges, he always arranged his creations in a specific pattern, largest to smallest, left to right. He measured each truffle with calipers before presentation to ensure this precise arrangement. The 6th truffle, being the practice piece, was slightly smaller than the others due to testing, approximately 0.3 millimeters smaller in diameter. It would naturally be placed in the rightmost position in his presentation box, and Fontaine, as the presenter, would traditionally take the first truffle from the box, which, after arranging them from largest to smallest, would be the one on the far left, the largest and most perfect specimen. Unless he changed his habit that day, Isabella Romano interjected, though her voice lacked conviction. Ah, but he did not. We have testimony from 6 different competitions over the past 3 years. Fontaine always, without exception, took the leftmost truffle when tasting with judges. It was a superstition, a ritual he believed brought good fortune. The murderer knew this through careful observation and exploited it perfectly. They removed the practice truffle, poisoned it, and replaced it in such a position that when Fontaine arranged his truffles by size, the poisoned one would be smallest. Fontaine would then naturally place it on the right side of the box. But, and here is the crucial detail, before presentation he would rearrange them one final time, placing the best specimen, always the largest, on the left, which is where he would take his own truffle from. The poisoned truffle, being smallest, remained on the right throughout this process. William Henderson frowned, his casual demeanour replaced by intense concentration. Wait, I'm confused. If the poisoned truffle was on the right and he always took from the left, how did he end up with the poisoned one? An excellent question, because Fontaine did not take from the left, not this time. At the last moment, he deviated from his habit, and this deviation was engineered by the murderer through a subtle psychological manipulation. The detective turned to face the blackboard again, drawing a diagram of the presentation box and the arrangement of truffles. The murderer placed a tiny, almost invisible mark on the inside lid of the presentation box, positioned such that when opened, it would catch Fontaine's eye and make him glance down at the rightmost truffle. Combined with a whispered comment made just before presentation, a comment about saving the best for last, this created a subconscious compulsion. Fontaine, already nervous and suggestible, reached for the rightmost truffle instead of his usual choice. A small manipulation, but devastatingly effective. Captain Beaumont nodded slowly, beginning to understand. But who whispered this comment? And who had access to mark the box? Chapter 9. The Confession. The detective turned to face Professor Larson directly. "It was you, Professor. You whispered the comment when you leaned close to examine the presentation box during the formal inspection, a moment captured on the security cameras. And you marked the box during the preliminary equipment check the day before, when you specifically requested to examine the presentation materials for academic interest." The elderly scientist did not deny it. Instead, he removed his spectacles with trembling hands and set them carefully on the table before him, his weathered face suddenly looking ancient and exhausted. His shoulders sagged as decades of careful control crumbled away. "How did you know?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Several things betrayed you, Professor. First, the chemistry. Only someone with your specific expertise could have created such a sophisticated poison delivery system. The activation temperature, the moisture threshold, the crystallization process. These required advanced knowledge of both chemistry and material science. Second, the timing. You alone knew exactly when Marguerite planned to publish her research, knowledge you would have gained through your close collaboration with her. When she died suddenly, you became suspicious, and your investigation would have revealed the truth. Third, your reaction during our interview. When I mentioned the journal, you did not ask which journal, though Marguerite surely kept many throughout her long career. You knew immediately which one I meant because you had been hunting for it these 2 years. The detective's voice softened slightly. But most damning was your behavior at the competition itself. You arrived 2 days early, claiming you wished to tour Brussels. In fact, you were preparing your revenge. You purchased gold leaf from 3 different suppliers, mixing and treating it in your hotel room. The chambermaid reported a chemical smell, though she thought nothing of it at the time. You studied Fontaine's previous competitions on video, learning his habits, his superstitions, his precise movements. And you arranged to be the last judge to inspect the preparation area, giving you the opportunity to plant your marked truffle. Professor Larson nodded slowly, tears beginning to stream down his weathered cheeks. "I loved her, you know. Not romantically. I'm far too old and she was far too devoted to her work for such complications. But I loved her mind, her brilliance, her passion for knowledge. She was like a daughter to me, or perhaps a brilliant colleague who gave meaning to my declining years. When she died, I knew immediately something was wrong. The medical report mentioned burns, chemical exposure, but the authorities called it accidental, perhaps something in her workshop, and her family wanted it buried quickly to avoid scandal. They cremated her body within 3 days, destroying any possibility of further investigation. And when you discovered Fontaine had the journal, it took me 18 months of detective work. I contacted everyone who had visited Lyon around the time of her death. I investigated theft reports, hired a private investigator, spent my life savings tracking down leads. Finally, I discovered that Fontaine had been seen entering Marguerite's workshop the morning of her death. He claimed he was returning borrowed equipment. But I knew the truth. I could not prove he killed her directly. Perhaps he merely bought the journal from whoever did. But he knew it was stolen property. He used her genius without credit, without acknowledgement, without a moment of shame or hesitation. He was going to win this competition using her techniques, claim glory, and prize money for work that should have made her famous and financially secure in her final years. Madame Mercier stood, her composed facade finally breaking completely. "Henrik, you should have come to me. We could have exposed him legally, through the press, through the competition authorities. There were other ways." "Were there, Colette?" The professor's voice turned bitter. "With what evidence? The journal in his possession proves nothing. He would claim he found it, purchased it innocently from an antique dealer, any number of plausible lies. His lawyers would destroy any case we brought. No, this way the truth emerges publicly. Everyone now knows those techniques were not his. Marguerite will be remembered, as she deserves. Her name will be associated with this revolutionary work, not his. That was worth my life, worth my freedom. The detective's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. Professor, I understand your grief, even your desire for justice, but you have committed murder, premeditated, carefully planned murder. You must face the consequences of your actions, regardless of how justified they felt to you. I know. I have always known I would, from the moment I began preparing the poison. I'm an old man, monsieur. I have had my career, my accolades, my contributions to science. What remained for me was only this, ensuring Marguerite's genius was recognized and her murderer punished. I have accomplished both. I am content to face whatever comes next. Captain Beaumont approached slowly, handcuffs in hand. Professor Henrik Larsen, I'm arresting you for the murder of Édouard Fontaine. You have the right to remain silent. As Captain Beaumont placed handcuffs on the elderly scientist with surprising gentleness, the other judges sat in stunned silence. Isabella Romano was crying openly. Her earlier bravado completely vanished. Even the stoic Madame Mercier dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Anton Kraus stared at the floor, his face ashen. William Henderson had stopped chewing his gum, his casual American demeanor replaced by something approaching shock. The detective watched as Professor Larsen was led away, the old man's back straight despite the handcuffs, maintaining his dignity even in defeat. Justice had been served, but it tasted bitter indeed. Chapter 10. Justice and Chocolate. 3 months later, the detective sat in a small cafe in Brussels, enjoying a cup of hot chocolate prepared in the traditional Belgian style, thick, rich, served with a small pitcher of cream. His companion joined him at the marble-topped table, carrying the afternoon newspaper, his face bearing an expression of mixed emotions. The trial concluded today, his friend reported, settling into the bistro chair and ordering his own chocolate from the hovering waiter. Professor Larsen received 15 years, though the judge acknowledged the mitigating circumstances extensively in his remarks. There's already a strong movement to have his sentence reduced on appeal. Several prominent scientists have written to the king himself, pleading for clemency. The detective nodded thoughtfully, stirring his chocolate with a small silver spoon. Justice is complicated, my friend. The professor killed a man, there is no doubt of that. The evidence was overwhelming, and he confessed fully, yet his victim was himself a thief and quite possibly a murderer. The law must be absolute, but our hearts may still hold compassion for the complexities of human motivation. And Marguerite Dubois, what of her legacy? Ah, there is a small justice after all, and perhaps it is the most important one. The detective's face brightened slightly. The journal has been donated to the Culinary Institute in Paris, where it will be studied and her techniques properly credited. Madame Mercier has established a scholarship in her name, the Marguerite Dubois Fellowship for Innovation in Chocolate Arts. It will provide funding for 5 young chocolatiers each year to study in Paris. The first recipients were announced last week. His companion smiled, taking a sip of his freshly arrived chocolate. So, something good emerged from all this tragedy. As it often does if we allow it, Isabella Romano has written a book about her brother's experience and the darker side of culinary competitions. It is quite successful, I understand. Anton Kraus has become an advocate for transparency in judging. Even the American Henderson has established ethical guidelines for his own competitions. People learn, they grow, they change. It is the silver lining to these dark clouds. But Professor Larsen remains in prison. For now, yes, but I have heard whispers that the Minister of Justice is reviewing the case personally. The professor's age, his previous contributions to science, the circumstances of his crime, all weigh in his favour. He may yet spend his final years in freedom, though marked forever by what he did. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the Brussels streets bustle with afternoon activity, businessmen hurrying past, tourists consulting maps, locals greeting each other with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. Life continued, indifferent to tragedy, always moving forward. The detective broke the silence with a philosophical observation. "You know, my friend, this case taught me something important about the nature of justice. We speak of it as if it were simple, black and white, guilty or innocent. But life is rarely so clear. Fontaine was a thief and possibly a murderer, yet he died horribly. Larsen was a murderer, yet he acted from love and a desire for justice. Where does the truth lie in such situations?" "I don't know, do you?" "I know only that we must do our best with imperfect knowledge and complicated emotions. The law provides structure, guidelines, consequences, but wisdom requires us to see beyond the law to the humanity underneath. Larsen will be punished, as he must be, but he will also be remembered for his attempt to honour his friend's memory, misguided though his methods were." His companion nodded, understanding the complexity his friend was articulating. "And Fontaine, how will he be remembered?" "That is perhaps the most interesting question of all. In death, he has become a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of ambition without ethics, of success built on stolen foundations. His name will forever be associated with scandal rather than achievement. In a way, Professor Larsen succeeded in his goal of destroying Fontaine's reputation, even if the cost was terrible." The waiter returned to refill their cups, and they thanked him with the easy politeness of regular customers. The detective had been coming to this cafe for years, finding in its quiet corners and excellent chocolate a refuge from the darker aspects of his work. "You know," his companion said thoughtfully, "in all the excitement, we never got to taste one of those famous truffles, the ones that weren't poisoned, I mean. The authorities kept them as evidence, but I heard they were genuinely extraordinary." The detective laughed, his eyes twinkling with genuine amusement. "My friend, I think I've had quite enough of chocolate for now, at least chocolate connected to murder cases. Besides, I prefer my desserts somewhat less complicated and definitely less poisonous. Give me a simple cup of hot chocolate honestly made over the most sophisticated truffle in the world. Yet you must admit, there's something poetic about a chocolatier dying from his own stolen creation, like something from a Greek tragedy." "Perhaps, but I prefer my poetry in books, not in morgues. This case had too much tragedy and too little comedy for my taste. Though I suppose if one looks for humour, there is something grimly amusing about a man being undone by his own rigid habits. Fontaine's superstitious nature proved his downfall. Had he simply grabbed a random truffle, he might have lived. Unless the professor had poisoned all of them. No, that would have been impossible. The professor's entire plan relied on killing only Fontaine. Had any judge been harmed, the careful moral distinction he maintained would have collapsed. He saw himself as an executioner, not a murderer. A fine distinction, perhaps, but an important one to his conscience. They finished their chocolate slowly, savouring both the beverage and the conversation. Outside, the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, painting the old buildings in shades of gold and amber. "Will you take another case soon?" his companion asked, knowing the answer even as he posed the question. "But of course, there is always another mystery, another puzzle demanding solution. Yesterday I received a letter about a disappeared painting, quite interesting, and this morning a telegram concerning a locked-room murder in Antwerp. The criminal mind never rests, and therefore neither can those of us who oppose it. Your work is never done. Nor would I wish it to be, my friend. What would I do with myself in retirement? Take up gardening? Collect stamps? No, the little grey cells require exercise, constant stimulation. Without mysteries to solve, they would grow lazy and fat, like a cat that lounges in the sun all day." His companion smiled at the image, recognizing the truth in it. The detective was born for this work, shaped by temperament and talent, for the pursuit of truth through darkness and deception. "One more question, if I may," his companion ventured. "Did you suspect the professor from the beginning? You seemed so certain throughout the investigation." The detective's moustaches twitched, a sign of pleasure at being asked about his methods. "Ah, you wish to know the workings of my mind. Very well. I suspected him almost immediately, though I could not prove it at first. You see, when we examined the preparation area, I noticed something others missed, a very faint chemical smell, not chocolate, near where the cooling rack stood. My nose, it is very sensitive. This smell was characteristic of certain cyanide compounds. Who among our suspects would recognize such a smell, know how to work with such materials? Only the professor. But that's hardly conclusive evidence. No, indeed, but it started me thinking in the right direction. Then, when I learned about the missing journal and the professor's close relationship with Marguerite Dubois, the pieces began to align. His presence at the competition, ostensibly as a judge but really as something more, his careful attention to details during the equipment inspection, his positioning near Fontaine during the presentation, all these small things accumulated into certainty. And the marked box, the whispered comment? How did you discover those? The mark I found through careful examination with my magnifying glass, a tiny scratch that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. As for the comment, that required deduction and then verification through witness interviews. Several people standing near the judge's table recalled the professor leaning close to Fontaine just before the tasting. When I asked specifically what he might have said, one witness remembered the phrase about saving the best for last. It all fit together perfectly, like a mathematical proof. His companion shook his head in admiration. "Your attention to detail never ceases to amaze me." "It is not amazing, it is merely thorough. Anyone could do the same if they trained their powers of observation properly. But most people see without observing, hear without listening. They miss the crucial details because they do not believe details are crucial. This is their error." The cafe owner approached their table, inquiring if they required anything else. The detective glanced at his watch, that enormous turnip of a timepiece he carried everywhere, and declared they must be going. "I have an appointment with the examining magistrate regarding the Antwerp case. It seems there are some documents requiring my review. Will you accompany me, or do you have other obligations?" "I'll come along. Your cases have become rather addictive, I'm afraid. Ordinary life seems dull by comparison." "Ah, but ordinary life is never truly ordinary if one knows how to observe it properly. The greatest mysteries often hide in the most mundane circumstances. A missing button, an unusual stain, a letter arrived at the wrong time. These small irregularities in the fabric of the everyday lead us to extraordinary truths." They paid their bill and stepped out into the Brussels evening. The city had transformed in the fading light, becoming somehow more mysterious, more full of possibility. Street lamps were beginning to flicker on, casting pools of warm light onto the cobblestones. As they walked toward the magistrate's office, the detective continued philosophizing. "You know, this case with the chocolatier will stay with me for some time. Not because of its complexity, I have solved more difficult puzzles, but because of its moral ambiguity. In most cases, there is a clear villain and clear victims. Here, the lines were blurred. Fontaine was both victim and perpetrator. Larsen was both murderer and avenger. Even Marguerite Dubois, the original victim, played her role through the legacy she left behind. Do you think Larsen would do it again, given the chance?" The detective considered this carefully. "I believe he would make the same choice, yes. His actions came from deep conviction, from love and a sense of justice that transcended law. Such motivations are the most dangerous precisely because they come from our better natures twisted by circumstance. A man who kills for money or power can be deterred. A man who kills for love or honor will not be stopped by threat of punishment. That's rather pessimistic. Perhaps, but it is realistic. And realism serves us better than optimism in my profession. If I assumed all people were fundamentally good, I would be a very poor detective indeed. They arrived at the magistrate's building, an imposing structure of grey stone that spoke of the law's solemnity and permanence. Before entering, the detective paused and turned to his companion with a slight smile. But let us not end our discussion on such a sombre note. Tonight, after this tedious appointment, we shall dine at that excellent little restaurant near the Grand Place. You know the one, with the mussels that are always perfect. And we shall drink good Belgian beer and speak of pleasant things rather than murder and poison. Agreed? Agreed, though I suspect even at dinner you'll be solving some mystery or another, observing the other diners, deducing their secrets from the way they hold their forks. The detective laughed, that rich, genuine laugh that transformed his usually serious face. You know me too well, my friend. Yes, I confess, the mind cannot be turned off like a lamp. It continues to work, to analyze, to deduce. But I shall try to restrain my observations to silent thoughts rather than spoken commentary. Will that suffice? It will have to. They entered the building together, passing from the amber evening light into the harsh electric illumination of official corridors. Another case awaited, another mystery to unravel. The work of justice continued, complicated and imperfect, but necessary nonetheless. And somewhere in a Paris culinary school, young chocolatiers studied techniques from a leather-bound journal, learning from a master they would never meet, carrying forward a legacy that had survived theft, murder, and revenge. In this, perhaps, was the truest justice, that knowledge could not be killed, that genius would find its way into the world regardless of the obstacles placed before it. The little detective smiled to himself as he climbed the marble stairs to the magistrate's office. Life was complicated, justice was imperfect, but truth had a way of emerging eventually, like chocolate carefully tempered to achieve the perfect crystalline structure. His job was simply to help that process along, one case at a time, one mystery at a time, until his own final truffle was consumed and his own story reached its inevitable conclusion. But that was for another day, perhaps many years hence. For now there was work to be done, mysteries to solve, and yes, excellent mussels to be enjoyed later that evening. It was, all things considered, a good life for a detective who believed in the power of observation, the importance of method, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. The case of the chocolatier's last truffle was closed. Justice, in its complicated way, had been served. Thank you for joining me, Stephen, on this journey through the world of cozy mysteries. The tale of Professor Larsen and Édouard Fontaine reminds us that even in the pursuit of justice, we must guard against becoming what we oppose. Revenge, no matter how justified it seems, exacts a terrible price from both the avenger and the avenged. Until next time, may your mysteries be cozy, your solutions elegant, and your chocolate always untainted by poison. Good evening and sweet dreams.